now I would like to introduce our first speaker. Deborah Elms has joined us a number of years in this program, then as founder of the Asian Trade Center, and she was always one of the, as Alyssa mentioned about the evaluations, she was always one of the most highly rated from the previous fellows. And this year she joins us for the first time as head of trade policy at the Hinrich Foundation. She also was president of the Asia Business Trade Association, board director of the Asian Trade Center Foundation, also on the board of the Trade and Investment Negotiation Advisor at the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia Pacific, on the Advisory Council for APCO recently, as well as a member of the World Economic Forum's Trade and Investment Council, also recently, 2018 to 2020. So she is, her qualifications go on, and she is kind of the perfect person to give you all, to deliver the keynote today and give you all a real kind of lay of the landscape of the international trade issues that we're going to be talking about throughout the week. So please join me in welcoming Deborah Elms.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to set this here in case I start to choke. Very happy to be here. I'm particularly happy always whenever I have an opportunity to work with reporters on trade. Trade is very sexy. It's always been very sexy, but it's especially becoming more important as time goes on. And so, you know, I think I've been doing this for a long time. We don't need to get into how long, but it's been a while. And for a long time, I would say, like, my family had no idea what I did, particularly my mother, who was always clueless. And then, as we start to get to things like trade wars, all of a sudden, even my mother understands what trade is, and at least some of the language, you know, asking me about things like tariffs and what is going on in import restrictions. You know, I mean, this is a new world we're living in. And so it's always been very sexy, but becoming much more interesting. And I'm very happy to hear so many of you who are either dealing with this day by day or who have an interest in learning about trade now, because you can also see why it matters. The last time I did this, I was batting cleanup, which I guess that's an American expression, but it's the sort of the last person to come to the plate in baseball, and everybody's already where they need to be, and you just deal with whatever happened. You're like the last one up. And so for me, that was pretty easy because you had all had several days of discussions about trade, and I just said, I'm not going to speak, I'm just going to answer questions. So I didn't have any speech, we just did Q&A. But that would be weird on the first day. So I'm going to have to give you a few remarks at least to sort of set the tone, set the stage a little bit, at least from my perspective. But I am going to still open up for Q&A because I think when you're in a room full of reporters, I know you will ask questions. I know they will be good questions. And I know that you have things that you have been wondering about or looking for clarification on or looking for answers that you haven't been able to ask. And so since you have me, this could be a moment, okay? So keep in the top of your head, I'm going to open for Q&A here. Please ask me some good ones, because I'm going to keep my remarks pretty short. Okay. So as you well know, trade has always been challenging, but it was much less challenging for a very long period of time. And partly that was because it just sort of chugged along, and there were changes that were taking place, but they were largely beneath the surface. System had largely been put together in the post-World War II era. Governments knew what they needed to do. Businesses knew more or less how to manage. There were changes around the margin, but it wasn't a huge challenge. Until when? Actually, I don't know when the date is in which all of this shifted. I would say a couple different things maybe mattered. Maybe, 9/11 was the beginning of a challenge, both politically for security reasons, but also economically, because 2001 is the last time that we tried to start a new round of negotiations at the World Trade Organization. And it was successful. The launch was successful at that time because we had It followed 9/11, and there was a sort of moment in time where governments were trying to be cooperative with one another. So 9/11 is in September. In November of 2001, we're able to launch the World Trade Organization's Doha Development Round. Lots of enthusiasm about cooperation, about the future integration. And then it all fell apart. And it's not exactly clear when this all fell apart, but certainly by 2008, the Doha Development Agenda was dead, although nobody can declare it dead. It's actually been dead for a while. And there was increasing fraying of the bonds that hold together key countries and the bonds that connect those countries to the system that had grown up alongside many of these governments, right? So 2008, coming in the wake of the financial crisis, was a turning point, I think. But we still sort of limped along. So we limped along until, I don't know when, again, we'll have to figure out someday what the dates actually are. But as of today, I would say, by the time that Donald Trump takes office in 2016, we had a totally different universe. And we have seen that universe evolve clear through today, and we will continue to see that through, just looking at ages in the room, through most of your lifetimes, I'm guessing. I mean, that's how much of a momentous change that we're living through right now, I think. So what did Donald Trump do? Well, he did a number of things. I think tomorrow morning you hear more about US elections and Donald. I'm not going to obsess about the man unless you ask questions. But one thing that he did that was quite different is he was quite clear that the system that had underpinned economic growth was not working for the United States, and that the United States was prepared to do something very different. So he put on the table a whole variety of tools and techniques that we hadn't seen for decades out of the US or anywhere. And he basically, in my view, opened Pandora's box and began pulling out tools, rationales, arguments that have led to a continuing deterioration of the global economic system for trade, certainly. I will leave security and economics to the side for the moment. So on the trade side, new tools, starting with escalation of tariffs, the return of tools like Section 301, which was a unilateral tool the United States had in the 70s and 80s, that was retired in 2000. It retired in 1995, resurrected from the bin by the Trump team. So unfair trade practices, the use of tariffs, arguments about national security, which we had not seen before, conflicts with major powers, most notably, of course, between the United States and China, as all of you are quite aware. And again, opening up the space for governments to think differently about trade. It was less about integration. It was much more about domestic concerns, which, to be clear, have always been there, right? No government acts without their domestic considerations. But they also had a hope of sort of collaboration that has largely evaporated for some governments and some markets. And that has created an entirely new world. Now, this may sound a bit alarmist, because I think a lot of people haven't quite recognized the extent to which the world in 2024 is different from what has come before. And the world that we had, especially here in Asia, where we are so trade dependent, one of the things I like best about this room at the Hinrich Foundation is that when you look out this window, I think this is trade, right? This view to me is trade. All the shipping containers, you can see the aircraft coming in, you can see the original river in which the reason Singapore was set up was for the trade activities here. The financial district, all of the banks over here. Straight across from us is a casino and integrated resort, so services trade. This is trade. This is what integration looked like, or has looked like. And the question, of course, is how much longer will this continue? And how complicated will it be? We can see, even through this window, evidence of challenges, not the least of which is the volume of ships that are now anchored out here. There's always some ships that are anchored, to be clear. But this is an unusual number of ships anchored outside because of supply chain disruptions. Supply chain disruptions for lots of different reasons, not the least of which is issues out of the Red Sea with the Houthi attacks, has led to changes in supply chains, integration for goods, integration for services, increasing restrictions on what kinds of services can be delivered, restrictions on what kind of data can flow, what kind of information can go back and forth, is creating a whole new world. Now, where that leads us, I don't think we know yet. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to sort of snap back to normal anytime soon either. So I think one of the reasons why so many people are unsettled is because you can sense that there's a big change underway, but it isn't clear what that change is going to look like. It isn't clear how long that unsettled period is going to be. And I don't think anyone has a crystal ball yet to figure out what it looks like ahead. And so that is disconcerting for most people, right? You like to know where the world is headed. You like to know your place in that space. You like to know what is likely to happen next year or next month. And we are not in those times. Now, the good news, since I'm speaking to reporters, of course, the good news is that your job has never been more valuable, really, right? Because when people are unsettled, they're looking for information. How do I make sense of the world? What are the things that I need to pay attention to? What are the trends that I can ignore? Hopefully, they are looking to news sources, and hopefully you're all good at your jobs, and you can give them some sort of input about what are the key points or the key issues, concerns that they need to think about today, and the things that they need to be paying attention to for tomorrow. Sadly, you're probably not going to totally change the universe any more than I'm going to totally change the universe, but at least you can give people clear information, hopefully backed up by facts and data, put together in a way that's sensible analysis, delivered in a kind of language that makes sense to the normal person who is reading or watching, listening to your news. I think that's more important than ever. And so I don't want to be too dramatic exactly, but I think we're at this sort of precipice moment where things are quite different going ahead, and trying to figure out where we go is the big question, or at least one of the big questions. Of course, if I had this discussion with security and politics people, they would say, no, it's my big question, which is partly what also the challenge, right? It's all sort of intertwined, security, politics, and economics, in a way that we didn't used to have, including here in Asia. And I think that is unsettling. That is very unsettling. It's certainly unsettling for people who've made this a business, right? Like, but I think it's also, again, that sort of challenge to try to see your way clear. What are the signposts that you should be following? What are the issues that you should be thinking about today, tomorrow, and then, again, ahead in the future? So I'm very happy that you're all here. And I'm really happy that the National Press Foundation and the Hinrich Foundation have come together to say this is important. We should invest time and resources in getting you all here. Because I think it is absolutely vital that we have an opportunity to pull back, make some sense of what's going on, try to think about things in a slightly different way, and lean on one another to answer the kinds of questions that you know are in your head. I'm sure they're in the heads of your people around you, and certainly in the heads of your audience, to sort of figure out where we go from here. So I think what I'm going to do, because I now have time, I promised you I was going to ask questions. Let's see how this goes. So let me just open it up to questions or comments. Doesn't have to be questions. I mean, I didn't give you a whole lot to go on, but I know that you're brimming with questions anyways. So let's see. Yes, here we go.
Yeah, I'm Phúc. I'm from Forbes, Vietnam. I think we just sit in the room and talk about the future. It's not the right way, but you just said about Mr. Trump, and I think Trump CEO countries are unreliable, and the relations between the U.S. and other alliance is just the transactional. And what do you think if Trump version 2 come back?
Okay, there's a tough one right out of the chute, right? Like, what are we going to talk about Trump? Okay. Well, you have a session tomorrow morning just specifically on this, but I have a feeling that Steve and I would agree on most of it, so, okay. Trump, yeah.
You can all of your opinion about the Trump
Yeah.
if he come back and
Yeah.
about the traffic policy,
Okay.
especially in many Chinese company come to Vietnam and set a company and the factory, and maybe we another Vietnamese company must have the taxes, but to tax to pay more in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, no, these are, clearly, this is a super important question. Sadly for me, because I think, oh my God, no more Donald days. No, 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 no. I mean, during his last term, you know, you get up, I'm sure all of you were familiar with this, you grab your phone first thing in the morning, you look at it and you say, what did Donald do yesterday? And then you know, how bad of a Donald day will this be? Is this going to be all day on Donald? Is this going to be something else? Mostly it's all day on Donald. Yeah, it could start again. Okay. Yes, it's possible that he'll come back. You know, the polls are always unclear, but the polls at the moment show him at least even and potentially in the lead over Joe Biden. So it is very likely, or at least possible, that he will be back in office in January. Now that creates a lot of challenges, particularly a lot of challenges in Asia. It creates challenges everywhere, but since we're all based in Asia, I'm going to talk about it from an Asian perspective. It creates a lot of challenges for Asia because Trump does not have the same connection to the system that we have had as almost anybody else. And he is, more than almost anyone, not afraid to shake things up, not afraid to do things differently, not afraid to describe things differently. So that creates a challenge, right? Now, there are lots of people who say not to worry about Trump because we've seen him before. He's transactional. That's a language that I hear often. This is a transactional guy. You take him to dinner, you flatter him, everything is great. I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, he was deranged the first time around. He is unhinged the second time. And I don't think he's going to be as transactional. And he's not going to be surrounded by the same group of people. And if you think I'm hyperventilating about this, I beg you to please go read the stuff that his transition team has already begun developing about what they intend to do in the Trump 2.0 administration. The America's First group, the 925,000-page dossier of what it is they intend to do. It shows you, even if they only implement half of it, it's a radically different agenda from the United States than we've seen in the past. And it will have real consequences here for Asia, including, and not limited to, Vietnam, I think, is going to be in real trouble because Vietnam has a very high trade imbalance with the United States. Trump has very few fixed ideas in his head. Save himself, 1. Trade is 2. He has, since the 1980s, he has been adamantly opposed to trade in general, but especially trade balances. He started running advertising in the 1980s about the Japanese at the time. If you read what he said and what he wrote in the 1980s, substitute China for Japan and it will look exactly the same. This is a pretty strong fixed viewpoint for him. Trade is bad, dependence on others is bad, reflected in the trade balance for goods only. He's not interested in services, he's only interested in goods. Which is weird, actually, if you think about it, because his entire life has been services. Everything he's ever done is a services transaction. Hotels and golf courses and resorts and media and real estate, services. But for some reason, he's not obsessed with services. He's obsessed with trade and goods. So trade balance is going to come back on the agenda. Vietnam, I think, is in the crosshairs for that reason. They're not the only one, but they will be in the crosshairs. We will see a lot more tariff escalation. As many of you will recall, he's already threatened a 10% across-the-board tariff and another 60% increase on trade with Chinese products. That is going to be hugely damaging to a trade-dependent part of the world. It will be complicated because if I impose a 10% across the board tariff, 60% on China, then I'm also going to have to watch very carefully that I don't have Chinese products coming into markets in this region like Vietnam, doesn't have to just be Vietnam, and then being exported to the United States. So there will be a whole lot more investigation on supply chains to make sure that Chinese produced goods, raw materials, are not embedded in products. That's going to be very disruptive for trade. Now, before you think it's all doom and gloom, because especially when I talk to businesses, they get very upset about this discussion and they say, but there has to be some good news, which is true, there is. Lots of new opportunities, right? And when you flip the table over and then you reset it for dinner, you have an opportunity to do things differently. And so there will be opportunities in this region, and there are opportunities in this region, not the least of which Asia itself is becoming more integrated. Because if your major markets have decided to abandon a system that has worked for a lot of the region, the reaction in part is let's double down on integration in Asia. So we see this activity in a lot of different ways. We have trade agreements that are crisscrossing Asia. Not all of you are involved in some of them, but one to keep an eye on for sure is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, because that is a potential tool for balancing trade at a time of disruption. Vietnam's a member. Vietnam's also a member of other trade agreements. I'm sure you'll hear about them the rest of this week. The Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP. They also have agreements with the Europeans, which is a good one. That's actually an excellent agreement. And others, which allow Vietnam some flexibility that is difficult if you don't have those free trade agreements to fall back on. At a time when the global system is stuck, you're going to need those free trade agreements to underpin economic growth and development. Trump doesn't care about those. He's not interested in having a trade agreement as such. He's fine with, in this case, the transactional part does come up. If you give me what I want, I might give you a piece of what you want. So maybe there'll be some kind of transactional type arrangements, but they will not look like a trade deal. They will not look like what we've done in the past. And it's going to be very problematic. And you already see this. I mean, once Trump put tariffs on the agenda as a legitimate policy tool, others have reached for it as well. So again, this week, I think you're having a talk on electric vehicles. The Europeans are imposing EV tariffs. The Canadians are about to impose EV tariffs. The use of tariffs has become a legitimate trade policy tool in a way that if you'd asked me this 10 years ago, I would have said, you're out of your mind. There is no way we're going to be raising tariffs. Like, no, we could do lots of things, but it's not going to be a tariff policy. And now here we are, tariff policy. So I think it will be challenging. And for the businesses that think, oh, we survived Trump 1, so Trump 2 is not going to be that bad, I think you're a bit delusional, frankly. I think this is going to be much different than the first time round. He is a different person. He's surrounded by different people. The world itself is not the same. I think it's going to be a real problem. So, you know, fingers crossed that American voters are a little more sensible in November, because otherwise we're all going to be paying a consequence for that.
Thank you so much for that. I have a,
Go ahead. No, you go ahead and then her.
okay. So I have a question that,
Yes.
like, from everything that you shared, correct me if I'm wrong, but policies are often an outcome of a system in function and not just like one person in power who randomly decides to do things. Of course, Trump changed a lot. But in terms of the US trade policy towards China, Biden has continued with whatever Trump came up with and even like imposed worse sanctions and tariffs in terms of China. So even if Trump comes in power again or Biden does, I don't think like much would change in terms of US policy towards China in particular. Do you have a different opinion on that?
No, I think that's a great point. I think what I would say there is that, again, Trump has opened up a door that is not just him now, although he's got very different approaches to this. I don't think Biden's team would say an across-the-board 60% tariff. I don't think that's a Biden initiative. However, the use of tariffs against China is now a legitimate policy tool. And in Washington, in particular, I don't think there is a policy that is too strong on China. I keep asking, what would it take for someone to say something on China that would be so outrageous that people would go, whoa, ho, ho, that's no, we can't do that. We can't talk about that. We can't implement that. I don't know what that policy is. I can't even find someone who could tell me what that would be. Like, what would be considered too harsh on China? It's both parties, the business community, it's very hard, especially, Washington is a bubble, admittedly, but it's hard to find anyone who is not hostile to China. And that is, again, especially sitting in Asia, a very alarming place to be in. Because it means that if you try to say anything positive about China, for example, you get tossed into this panda hugger category and you can't get yourself back out of it because you've now been dismissed. That's a challenge, right? That's a challenge. We have to figure out some way in which to get along. And certainly if you are in another third country, not the US, not China, you've got to live with both. So how do you live in a world that is increasingly painting the other as awful, right? This is hard. And you're right, it's not just Trump, although I think he's got a different magnitude, an order of magnitude, and a set of tools that he will pull for that are not necessarily the same tools that the Biden team will pull for. But again, we don't know. We don't know where this will go. The point is we have opened up that door, and a whole lot of policy options are on the table now that weren't there before.
So I have two questions.
Yes.
So the number one is, for the past few years, China has been shifting its assembly chain, its industrial chains to regions like ASEAN blocs and also Mexico. So do you think it's possible for the Washington to put further investigation or sanctions to products assembled from this region? Because they're origin from China.
Right.
And the number two question is, I recently interviewed a former official from China's economic planner, the NDRC. So according to him, for Chinese manufacturers, a smart way to avoid this tariff is to establish factories in Europe and in US, not only to avoid tariffs, but also to create contribute to the local job creation. So do you think this idea could be welcomed by Washington?
No. No on the second one. I think those are some great questions, excellent questions. Let me go with the second one first. Can you circumvent US tariffs on Chinese products by investing in China? This is the playbook the Japanese used in the 1980s. The Japanese, especially on autos, found themselves locked out of the US market by, at the time they were quotas, basically quotas in place. You could only export so many cars. The Japanese said, there's two things we're going to do. One is we're going to move up market. Why sell a very cheap Japanese car in a market that's difficult to get into? Forget that. We're going to go up market. And they decimated the top end of US manufacturing for cars because they became very competitive, and all of the cars in the 80s and 90s in the US were high-end Japanese cars. But they also invested heavily in the US to manufacture domestically, which they're still doing. That's the Japanese playbook. And it's clear that the Chinese would like to do something similar. So how do we get around a tariff wall? We invest in the market. The challenge for China specifically is the US, again, think about Washington, no policy is too harsh. Washington does not want Chinese inbound investment either. So the FDI flows into the US from China dramatically has fallen to near zero. And I don't think that's going to change. Now, does that mean that you can't invest? No, you can have all kinds of very creative ways in which Chinese investment into companies out of, say, Singapore then invest in the US you can do kinds of crazy things, yes. We'll see that, because if the tariff, for example, on electric vehicles right now into the US from China is 102.5%, then that's an incentive high enough for you to say, let me figure out some solution to that, right? Because at 102.5% tariff, I can't just sit back and export. I need to think about creative solutions to this. So there will be attempts to go around this. Now, the Chinese will say, but I thought part of this was you wanted to make in the United States. You wanted US manufacturing, you wanted US jobs. We're offering you US manufacturing, US jobs. What is the problem? The problem is that they're Chinese. So non-Chinese investment probably will be welcomed, but Chinese investment I don't think will be welcomed. Chinese investment into other markets to access the US market will also be at risk. So one of the things that we see now increasingly, for cars in particular, is manufacturing in Mexico to be able to export into the US. That is going to get harder and harder to do as well. But this gets, you can imagine like the complexity of this, right? So the original thing was, I don't want cars coming in from China. Fine. They come to Mexico. Stop them from Mexico. How do I stop them from Mexico? I have to think carefully about how we do this. What if it's not the whole car? What if it's just parts and components? What is the percentage of parts and components that I'm willing to accept in a car coming in from Mexico that has Chinese inputs? What if it's not totally Chinese inputs? What if it's a joint venture between a Chinese company and a European company? This is going to get super complicated, and it will be hard to administer. There will be lots of loopholes. There will be lots of companies that are going to try to exploit loopholes. US government officials in particular will be playing catch up, right? Because they're going to be like, oh, they found some, whack that one, and then another problem, you know. I think this, frankly, as a reporter, is job security, because you're going to have so many of these like sneaking through a loophole, which then gets shut, and then another loophole. There will be stories like this for you guys for probably a decade or more. So as a reporter, keep an eye. Those kinds of stories, probably always going to be in demand. Other questions? Fantastic.
Thanks for the sharing. So I'm most interested in the sanction policy. I'm just wondering, how do we see today's sanction works, especially during the Ukraine war? Because China learned from Russia at the same time. I'm just wondering if sanctions still could be used as a deterrence. And this is the first question. The second question would be, how do you see the alternative supply chain right now? I mean, because we've seen Putin visit Kim Jong-un and also Iran and China as well. I'm just wondering, how do you see the possible alternative supply chain will look like in the near future? Thanks.
Excellent set of questions. You know, the slightly good news about being in Asia, I mean, there are many things that are good, but one good thing from my perspective is that I haven't really had to deal with sanctions. And I haven't really had to deal very much with Ukraine. Because for the most part, it's happening, but it's not affecting trade relationships in Asia as much. That, however, could be changing for a variety of reasons, one of which is the effectiveness of sanctions policies. We know from an awful lot of work on sanctions, economic sanctions in particular, over the years, they are very, very hard to do well. We have almost no examples of sanctions that are effective in terms of changing the policy that you intended to change by having sanctions. And part of the reason for that is that unless you have 100% commitment, it's very hard to get someone to change their policy. And to get 100% commitment is almost impossible because, among other things, there are huge economic incentives to skirt a sanction, right? If no one else will trade with a party and you're willing to take on the risk, there is an awful lot of money to be made. You're the only one who will do it. You can charge more or less whatever you want, and guess what? You get the contracts. So it's very hard to have watertight sanctions. What they do, because if you have leaky sanctions, this is also no good, right? If we have sanctions that are in place and only some places and some companies are punished and others are rewarded, that's a problem. So you then keep tweaking and adjusting the sanctions policy to try to get to a point where you think you've got the outcome you're looking for. Also hard to uphold. And so one of the things that happens when you try to do this is that governments and companies watch, of course, and they say, okay, what if this happened to me? How can I avoid the same fate? How can I be structured? How can I do business? How can I manage my policies to not have that happen to me? And I mean, this natural consequence, in my view, to blocking economic activity in one area, it flows to someplace else. But that creates potentially unintended consequences that could be harder to deal with in the future. So I do think that there's an effort to pay attention to what is the consequences of the sanction activities. how can you avoid those risks? And in particular, one which I am not going to talk about more. I will just flag it for you. You find someone who's better at this than I am. But I will say that the US, again, talk about US using different tools. The US use of the banking system to reward and punish actors is a relatively new phenomenon, at least used in the way it is. And that could create some real long-term challenges. Because again, now you say, oh, well, if that's going to happen, then we will practice something else. So sanctions definitely on the agenda. In terms of top of mind for some, businesses and governments both, how do we avoid this in the future? And it fits in this larger narrative of what do we have to think about, particularly if we are engaged in complicated supply chain activities. So if you talk to companies, multinationals, et cetera, they will have a list of things that they're worried about. And at the top of their list, often now, is a category that's sort of vague, but risk. Geopolitical risk, uncertainty risk, whatever, some sort of risk thing, rocketed to the top of an awful lot of multinational agendas, driven in part by sanctions, in part by new tools, in part by a breakdown of the existing procedures. But that risk has gone very high on their agenda, and so trying to figure out how do we get around that? How do we think about it? How do we manage it? How do we mitigate it? Is a key consideration for companies. So even if you're not directly affected because of sanctions over Ukraine, you can be indirectly affected because it has given you this insight into, oh, you know, this is a possibility I hadn't thought of, and how do we manage that? So I think it's a good question. Other questions? Great, we got two over here.
Hi, I'm Tawhid from Bangladesh. The economy is facing, the world economy is actually going through a lot of crisis right now, and the one I can significantly point out is the inflation. The policies that you have been saying that the Trump is going to put more tariffs on the importing products and other initiatives and other policies that will hamper the overall import in USA, don't you think that this is going to increase the world inflation anyway if he is going to put more tariffs on the Chinese products even? That is one. And if it is going to happen, do you think United States is going to be ready for this much, to deal with this much inflation in future, considering the fact the effect of inflation right now, it has not given enough impact. It has not put enough impact on the US economy right now. But what about the future? What I'm trying to say is, do you think Trump will be mad or brave enough to put that kind of decisions in front, considering the inflation is going to be had in US as well?
Yes, I do think so. And he would say, it's not my problem, it's those dastardly Chinese, right? Those are the people who have caused this problem, not me, right? And you can imagine how that could resonate with a domestic audience. It's not us, it's not, this pain that you're feeling is a result of somebody else's bad behavior. But yeah, I think it's highly likely. The one other point that I would make, though, that is, I think, underreported in general about the US is the US does have the luxury of being able to do things that the rest of Asia certainly couldn't, for a couple reasons, not the least of which, of course, is its size and its strength and domestic economy and dollar and so forth. But another one is the relative lack of trade the United States has. Because the market is so big and because it is so diversified, the amount of the US economy that is reliant on trade is actually relatively small. So let me just go back to my picture of Singapore here. Singapore trades, depends on the year, but usually 300% of its gross domestic product is actually trade flows. So 300% more than its internal GDP is reflected in trade. That's how important it is. So if there's a problem, if the ships are parked out here and not moving, the implications for Singapore's domestic economy can be catastrophic, right? Very, very trade dependent. That is true for most of Asia. Not quite as bad as Singapore, but still very trade dependent. The US comparable figures is about 30%. So 300% for Singapore, 30% for the US. That means that there could be massive disruption in trade from the US perspective. And the damage would be not great, but it wouldn't be as catastrophic. And so I think one of the reasons why you can put up with real changes in the trade space for the US is because it's more isolated than other markets from trade flows in a way that I don't think gets reported out enough, partly because it's not a very interesting story really until it becomes an interesting story. So that's how you get around the inflation. You say, first of all, it's not going to be as bad because there's less trade than you might imagine. And two, I blame the other guy. Now, does that solve all of your problems? No, there will still be issues. But blaming the other guy is always an easier way to handle them. Yeah, you had a question here.
Yeah. So what's the way out? Because for Bangladesh, it's like we import all the raw materials from China, around 90%, and 10 to 11%, sometimes 15% sometimes from India. And whatever we produce is the first largest country to buy is USA, and then the other European countries and the Westerners. What's the way out? Because we are already scared. Bangladesh's government is definitely scared. There is a sanction given on the ex-IGP for violating the human rights. The US policy on the Bangladesh election didn't work it out. And then they had a policy shift. And then Mr. Donald Lu went to Bangladesh and said, we had a bad times and tensions before the elections. Let's look into the future. So in a way, US policy is failing in this part of the world. But trade is like,
Crucial.
yeah.
300% GDP. Yes. What are you going to do when your major markets are fighting with one another? Wow. That is the big question for most governments in this region. What can we do if the international system as a whole, especially represented in the case of trade by the World Trade Organization, if that continues to falter, then what? I think this is the question, right? I don't think anyone's got an answer to this. The first challenge to me is we haven't yet identified the scale of the problem. So we often find folks, when it comes to the World Trade Organization in particular, trying to tweak the edges, right? Trying to adjust problems at the institution, which is useful. Like the dispute settlement system that is broken. Let's fix the dispute settlement system. Okay. But if the major players don't care, then what? There is no dispute settlement system that I could design that will make a difference if the major players don't care if they lose. The system requires you to care whether or not you're going to win or lose, because then you will moderate your behavior accordingly. But if the major players don't care, that is a problem for all of us. So the first thing is to recognize that that's about where we're at. And then what do we do about it is the next giant question that is still unanswered. One of the things that you see, which you're starting to see more of, and again, I would highlight that you should maybe follow these stories, is the development of what's often called a middle power strategy. So these are countries in this region or elsewhere, they don't have to just be here, New Zealand, Australia, Japan. Japan's not really a middle power, but somehow they get third largest economy. They're always put in the middle power category. I find that weird, but okay. Japan, Canada, trying to sort out what solutions could we come up with? What kinds of approach could we follow that might get us where we want to go? What does that look like? You also see something very similar happening with a lot of the larger developing economies. India, South Africa, Indonesia, Brazil. Sometimes they're together, sometimes they're aligned, sometimes they're not. But trying to figure out how do we operate in a world where the traditional rules don't seem to be working. So far, we don't have an answer. We don't have an answer. And what that does, and I think your question really gets at this, is it leaves especially developing countries and least developed countries really screwed, honestly. Because if the system is breaking down and the system has resulted in a lot of economic growth, reduction of poverty, etc., system isn't going to work. Now what? What do you do if you are a developing country? Especially if you are a developing country in a neighborhood that does not have a functioning trade agreement to fall back on. Bangladesh again. What do you do? This is really difficult. This is really difficult. You know, the fallback option in a Singapore is much easier. First of all, it's richer to begin with, but it's also in a neighborhood that has a lot of other kinds of links that might fingers crossed, cushion it from some of the worst damage. But not everybody is in a favorably inclined neighborhood that's already started to cooperate. So what do they do? This is unclear. And again, I'd love to have an answer. I don't have an answer. I would say one answer is to just keep reminding everybody, like, the options are not great. Please think of us before you start having a sort of, war consequences that have implications for us, even in places you wouldn't have thought of. But that's not a very satisfying answer, honestly. So I suppose I would say then you have to look for opportunities. Again, if the system is breaking down, there should be new opportunities that weren't there before. And so one that I hear all the time from businesses in developing countries is not to worry. If the big players can't trade with each other, they can come to us. And we are neutral. We can trade with both. It'll be great. But that's the problem, right? That is a problem.
It doesn't work. Say, for example, I can give you an example. There was Russia is building a nuclear power plant in Bangladesh, and their ships are sanctioned. Okay, so when the Ukraine war was going on, all the EU ambassadors and the US ambassadors in Bangladesh, they went to Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They're trying to convince them, hey, buddy, be with us. But this time, Bangladesh was also preparing the IPS outlook, Indo-Pacific outlook of Bangladesh of its own, and that's first of a kind in the South Asia. So the ship was about to come to Bangladesh, sanctioned ship. Then it went to India. India said, I'm sorry, bye-bye. Then it went to China. China says, hey, buddy, I want you to go somewhere else to have a Starbucks. And then it went nowhere. And then in the middle of the sea, it transferred all the things. And that made the whole process around 2 months of the delay. Already it is delayed by 2 years. So Russians have now more causes, but Bangladesh is suffering because Bangladesh is paying every single penny of interest. So, yeah.
I think we're going to see more of these kinds of stories, honestly, because, again, as the system sort of starts to disintegrate, the challenges that puts up are going to be found in locations you might not have thought of, right? So my guess, I have no idea, I don't know how widely read all of you are, but my guess is that none of us were aware that there was this situation going on in Bangladesh, or that sanctions on Ukraine and Russia would have a consequence for power supply and power generation in Bangladesh. But here we are. So this kind of complicated story, of course, is part of the reason why your job is interesting but also challenging, because you have to try to pull at certain threads of a story that stay integrated. But it's complicated, and you only have, if you're on broadcast news, you have 600 words in which to make a case or less. Wow, that is hard. So trying to figure out how to be as clear as possible about consequences, I think, that's going to be the question for me. Can you make those stories relevant to people who otherwise wouldn't be aware of them? Super important. And best of luck. That's a tough one. Yeah.
So two things. One is you spoke about favorably inclined neighborhood. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? And second is, you began with saying how it really takes time for a reader, everyday reader, to actually make sense of trade. So as a journalist, how is it that we could actually, simplifying terms and all is good, but could you suggest ways in which we can actually make it more, put in more sense for our readers? At least when I'm talking from a perspective of a daily news reporter, wherein we really don't have the time to actually sit back and research everything. We have to make sense really quick. So how could we ourselves, ensure that we are conveying it rightly to the readers?
Okay, I'm going to start with the second question, because I think in ways that's easier, actually. The second question, how do you convey these complicated stories? I don't know. That's why you're journalists and I am not one. But one thing that works with people that I work with is you have to make the story personal. You have to make the story, take a big story, and somehow tie it to the individual who's reading, watching, whatever. And one way to do that I find successful is to do micro stories. So you're telling a big story through the eyes of something smaller. Because people can grasp smaller stories, whether it's a story about a small business that is struggling, whether it's a story about a power plant in Bangladesh that can't get power. You know, if you can localize the story and make it small, people tend to follow along with that better, and you have to make it, strip out some of the details, of course. But I find those micro stories and the small case studies more compelling than these big, complicated 30,000-foot level views of what's happening, because that is important. So some of you, please do still write those. I'm not saying that we should all write micro stories. I'm just saying that there needs to be a balance. And sometimes those smaller stories can get at the larger question in a way that is more relevant to someone. Because the large stories, especially now, can just feel overwhelming. You know, what am I going to do about that? But if you want to say, what can you do about the person in Bangladesh who's making a shirt? You know, how are they going to be able to continue to make shirts when we have this big global trade conflict going on? And when you can't use fabrics or yarns that are sourced from here or there, right? So the story that is still the same story, but brought down to the level of this firm or this individual, I find that that's easier. I leave it to you all to decide whether that works for you or not. Wait, you had a question on neighborhood too,
No,
though.
I just want to add a thing. So you just spoke about how breaking it down to the local level. So when I did apply for this fellowship, that was the story proposal I actually gave, which was how Mumbai has recently seen this major infrastructure development in the form of a coastal road, where the sea was reclaimed and we had a 10-kilometer road. So one of the worst affected people in this have been the local fishermen, you know, whose fishing activity, in fact, they were the major opponents to the road as well, whose fishing activity took a setback because they kept saying that the most catch we get is actually closer to the shore. So, you know, if you are going to reclaim that part where it's going to really hit our business. So yeah, I just want to add that was actually, I had broken it down to that local.
Yeah, look, I mean, those are the stories that I find resonate more. Now, again, I could be wrong, and it's important to do some big ones too, but sometimes the little ones, the more personal stories are a bit more compelling to people. You asked about neighborhood before I move on to another question. So neighborhood, if you sit in Southeast Asia, we have ASEAN and we have all of the ASEAN integration activities. We have decades of this, right? ASEAN's been trying to integrate for a very long time. Lots of agreements, lots of opportunities. That is working well. You're in a neighborhood that at least on paper, they don't always do it in practice, but at least on paper, they're cooperative. They're trying to solve problems collectively. They have a system in place to deal with a lot of issues, surface them, share best practices, whatever, right? There's lots of opportunities. Not every neighborhood is like that. So, example, Pacific Islands. So I just did this training with the WTO and in Asia, and we had a number of Pacific Island participants from Papua New Guinea, from Fiji, from Vanuatu. Okay, so they had to sit down, and one of the exercises we did was I put them in groups, and I said, please negotiate over oranges, orange juice, orange oils, whatever. They don't have agreements that deal with these issues, right? So they tend to have very high tariffs on oranges, 40% or higher. I put them in groups with countries that were partners in a variety of different settings. And because they are already partners in a variety of different settings, most of them have zero tariffs on oranges and orange products, orange juice, whatever. Okay, so what happened when I put them in groups? You will not be surprised to know the members who had agreements together looked at Fiji, Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea and said, go to zero. Eliminate your tariffs. We're already tariff-free. You eliminate your tariffs. Problem solved. But if you are in the Pacific, you're like, wait a second. That's a big deal, right? From 40% to zero is going to be a sudden potential influx of orange juice from the region. I can't go from 40 to zero. Now, why are they in this? Because they don't have a neighborhood that has helped them over time integrate and has helped them think about ways to deal with competitiveness challenges. So then when they suddenly get put in a group like the one that I did, they're at a disadvantage because they're not used to this. They haven't had practice at it. They don't have their tariffs being reduced collectively. They haven't an opportunity to talk about these issues. I mean, ASEAN, say what you will about ASEAN, and I could say a lot, but one thing I will say in its favor, they have 1,200 meetings a year in ASEAN. 1,200 meetings a year means that most officials, including the economic officials, they meet with their counterparts 3 to 4 times every year. So they have at least discussed an awful lot of stuff when they're meeting 4 times a year. That's a very helpful neighborhood. Again, it doesn't solve all their problems. They still disagree. They still do things that are not helpful, et cetera. But at least they have a structure that helps them, which other neighborhoods do not. And I would argue if the system as a whole is starting to fall down, you need those alternatives more than ever, because that's where you're going to have an opportunity to design cooperation. We had a question over here. Oh, and here too? Okay, so we have 2. Okay, then I have to wrap up because we're going to run out of time, I think, yeah?
Okay. Thank you,
Yes.
Deborah, for your inspiring sharing. Actually, I have a couple of questions. Yeah, so first of all, so Trump is going to introduce extremely high tariff and then also cutting all the imported goods. So what about the possible inflation in the country? So will he is he going to face some kind of domestic kind of pressure? And then my second question is it's like China and Russia, they are getting more closer together, and then China has been exporting a lot to Russia, and so what about Trump come back? And my not sure if you can cover all of them. My last question is, you said banking sanction is kind of a new phenomenon. So I was wondering, is it kind of like an ultimate tool that that can do quite a lot for global trade? Thank you.
Yes, on the third one, yes. We are seeing, again, the development in general of tools that we did not have before. Many of them are around the financial industry, financial services industry. And about banks specifically, about the rails that we use for moving money between banking and businesses in general, and whether those which have been US led for a very long time are going to continue to be the primary mechanism, or whether an alternative will develop. I think, we're in a bit of an uncharted territory here where we just don't know. Will we continue to see an escalation of tariffs? I think probably yes. Will it cause inflation? Probably yes. Probably a little less in the US, as I mentioned earlier, just because of the size of trade. But yes, it will cause inflation. Will it cause domestic political problems for the president? Possibly, but no matter who wins, he's not running for re-election. So he maybe doesn't care as much, right? Because he's not running. Now, maybe his vice president will be running, and maybe that matters. But if you don't care, I mean, this is one of the interesting things to me about being a politician. If I don't care what the consequences are, I could do all kinds of things that otherwise would be an issue. So again, it's only when I care about the outcomes that I am constrained in my behavior. If I think I'm rewarded for bad behavior, then of course I'm going to give you even more bad behavior. So on the inflation thing, for sure, we will have inflation. Is this now driving, to get to your middle question, and I apologize for doing them out of order, but is this driving potentially new coalitions or potentially new partnerships or relationships? Yes. Yes. Some of them are new. Some of them are, old discussions that you may have had that have been resurrected. Some of them are favorable, like this middle power coalition, I would argue, is kind of a favorable thing. We should have had it a long time ago, but it was hard to get middle powers to focus. When big powers would say, this is what we're going to do, and you would go, okay. But now suddenly you have the ability to make decisions yourself, middle powers getting together. I think we're going to see more of that as things start to unravel. Yes, last question.
Hi, thank you.
Yes.
Super interesting, firstly. I'm Georgie, I'm from Bloomberg. I'm interested in from where you're sitting, what's next for China? So the US, their strategy is a bit more public perhaps, and with Donald Trump, then who knows. But what does China sort of do next? How is their relationships with everyone evolving, and where to from here as supply chains sort of diversify?
Oh, that is a really good question. That's one where I am less confident. And part of the reason why I'm less confident is the part that makes me particularly nervous, We just have less communication back and forth than we used to. There are fewer people who are based in China who are still writing in English. There are fewer folks who are writing in English who are producing materials in China. And so we have less communication than we had. And I think that's disturbing, right? Because if you wanted to know what is the attitude of this or that entity, it is harder now than it used to be. A lot of those relationships got frayed under COVID, of course, when you couldn't travel in and out of China, big problem. But also because we have, I mean, I'm a US citizen. I was just in Shanghai. I felt fine. But there are lots of American citizens with a US passport who would say, I do not want to go to China. I don't know what will happen. I'm very nervous about it. That's a problem. That is a real problem because you'll never know what the Chinese are going to do if you're not hearing them, you're not talking to them, you're not listening to them. That's a challenge. So first, let me just point that out. That is a problem. So please, those of you who are there, you know, make a noise so that we get answers, which is very helpful. Yes? Excellent. You can give us insight, but not right now, just a second. She will come back to you in just a second. You know, what is China going to do? I think China is also struggling to figure out exactly what their responses should be, partly because they are also waiting to see what happens in this US election. What is the extent to which Trump can be transactional? Is there some way that they could manage to moderate some of the worst of the damage? If it's Biden, can they create a better relationship with the Biden administration? So I think some of it is that. Some of it is that the domestic issues in China are large and growing, and trying to sort out what that looks like. I would say, just like other countries, the Chinese government, in particular, is also looking out at a very unsettled world and trying to make sense of where do we go from here. The traditional engines of growth are slowing. The alternative engines of growth are potentially blocked. I mean, I think the Chinese anticipated green technology being a key portion. If that is a problem, then what? So I think just like in the US, just like here in Singapore, the Chinese leadership as well is also, I'm sure, trying to sort out how are they going to respond. And I think that has been a challenge for them as well. And of course, it feeds in, right? Because if the Chinese aren't sure what they're going to do, then the Americans aren't sure what they're going to do, which leads the Europeans to be going on regular visits, especially if you're German, to try to sort it out, you know, because we just don't have the same level of conversations that we had. And given the unsettled nature of the world we're in, what you used to think was acceptable may not be anymore. Relationships you used to have may not be functioning like they used to. And the opportunities to build new ones, I think, are muted.
Very, very useful. Deborah, thank you so much.
Sure. I'm around later too, so you can ask questions then. Thanks so much, guys.